All right, I'm going to start off with some scenarios here that I want, and I don't think it's too tiny, but let me just read this, and then we're going to discuss what's wrong with this. What's wrong with this? Jane is a 32-year-old lesbian who is seeing a physician she had never seen before. The physician asked her if she was sexually active. Jane said yes. Physician asked her what birth control she was using. Jane replied none. The physician asked her if she was trying to get pregnant. Jane replied no, but before she could explain, the physician began in talking about all the different birth control methods and responsible and safer sex and so forth. Okay, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this?
Heteronormative.
I'm sorry?
Heteronormative.
What's the assumption behind it?
That she's hetero, that she's not.
That she's engaging in heterosexual sex, right. That the physician had that only that view. That's an example of a microaggression. But Jane probably, her first one was probably when she walked in the office and began filling out the paperwork, you know, all the paperwork that you fill out when you go to a doctor's office for the first time. What would be the very first thing that Jane would have to face when she walked into that doctor's office and sat down to fill out her paperwork? Marital status. What are the choices on most sets of paperworks? Maybe not be quite so relevant today, but what are your choices? Married, single, widowed, divorced, okay? And the assumption behind that then is, again, heteronormative. Biological sex, check one, male or female. Only they call it gender. And we all know that there's a difference between biological sex and gender. Okay? But what are your choices when they want to know what's your biological sex or what your gender is? They call it gender, male or female. So that was probably the first thing Jane experienced. But this then gets to be the big one. So what did she learn from this? She can't trust her physician, or the physician is uninformed, the physician is heterosexist, the physician is homophobic. I mean, Jane has all those choices. Then she has to make a decision about whether or not she continues and tries to educate this physician, or she gives up and goes through the whole process trying to find another physician. Now, there's a PS to this story. There's another part to this story that I didn't put up on the slide. This was a real client of mine. And this conversation took place while the physician was conducting her pelvic exam. Guys in the audience, do you know what that involves? A pelvic exam. Okay, he had inserted his fingers into her vagina, into her canal to check out her uterus and her internal workings, okay? He withdrew his hand suddenly, walked out of the room, leaving Jane there on the table in the stirrups. The next thing she knows, a different physician walks in the room to continue her exam. Yes. Okay. Yes. That helped Jane to decide to find another doctor, by the way. Okay. How about, this is also a true story. Two colleagues, one Asian American, the other African American, board a small plane. A flight attendant tells them they can sit anywhere, so they choose seats near the front of the plane and across the aisle from each other so they can talk. At the last minute, three white men enter the plane and take the seats in front of them. Just before takeoff, the flight attendant, who is white, asked the two colleagues if they would mind moving to the back of the plane to better balance the plane's load. Both of them became angry, feeling like they were singled out to sit at the back of the bus, quote unquote. They expressed it to the attendant and she denied it and saying she just thought she could give them some privacy. Were they being overly sensitive, or was the flight attendant being racist?
The flight attendant was probably being racist.
Okay, overtly racist? Do you think she said to herself in her head, oh, these two people of color, I'm going to move them
Not necessarily.
Okay, okay, you had your hand up.
Might have been sexist,
How so?
as in moving female instead of moving males.
They were all male.
Oh, I apologize.
But, nice thought. Okay, so was she, okay, so and she vehemently denied, and this actually happened, it's a well-known researcher in the area of cultural diversity. His name is Daryl Sue, and he is a psychologist and has written books like Counseling the Culturally Different, and he has actually written books on microaggressions. He was the Asian American psychologist that was involved in this, and likely she didn't see it as racist, but she acted in a racist manner. And that's the nature of microaggression, is that we see people who consciously propose equality, fight for rights, but these, what we call intrinsic biases, slip out when you least expect them. All right. I was reading about sometime last year, there is a reverend, his name is William Barber. He is the president of the NAACP chapter in North Carolina. He was on an airplane. It seems to be the topic these days, flight attendants and airlines, but I really didn't do this on purpose. He was on a plane, I think it was last year. It popped up on the internet again, probably because of the recent stories. But he was on an airplane last year. He's disabled, and I think he has a frozen neck, and he cannot turn his neck. He was seated. There was a gentleman behind him in the seat that was making racist comments about him. The door to the plane was still open. They had not done the safety check. So Reverend Barber got up and turned around so that he could address this man and ask him. Now he's a very kind, very gentle, he's a powerful man, but very kind, very gentle African-American man. He's asking this man, why are you saying those things? And the flight attendants came in and said, you have to leave the plane. And they had called the police and they escorted him off. Okay. Instead of the man that started it, sitting there, the white man who was making the racial comments. Okay. All right, let's look at some others. Professor Smith is a new instructor in a graduate program in psychology. First couple of classes that semester were somewhat tense, so as an icebreaker on the third or fourth class meeting, he brought a handout of jokes to class to lighten the mood and started passing them out. The title at the top was, you know you're having a bad day when. One of the items about halfway down was, when you put your bra on backwards and it fits. Some of the female students in the class got upset. This happened, I was in class. This is also another true story. Is that a sexist microaggression? What the rest of you think? Julie's nodding her head. What do the rest of you think? Okay. What about his intent? And he protested. He says, well, I just want to have some laughs. I just want to get everybody to relax. Of course, it didn't, because most of the women were immediately tense. But was that sexist? Was that a microaggression? Does it make any difference whether or not he intended it to be? Okay. What harms others? Intent or behavior? Behavior. Very good. How about I left out the T. Maybe that's my own microaggression. An LGBTQ client noticed that a therapist office only displays heterosexual books and pamphlets. Okay, by omission. How about the friend who claims to be colorblind, or who says to their African-American friend, I don't think of you as black? Okay, that's omission. That's making people invisible. There was there's a great example on an HBO movie the other night, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't read the book, do it. But there's a scene in which the white reporter and the African-American woman, who is the older daughter, or the daughter of Henrietta Lacks, I won't go into the book, but they're in this partially abandoned mental hospital looking for records of Deborah's older sister. Deborah is the African-American woman, her older sister. And they're walking down this vacant hallway, and they're, hello, hello, is anybody here? And this white woman comes out of a doorway, and she says, what do you two want? Deborah, played by Oprah Winfrey, character Deborah, the black woman says, well, we're looking for, my sister died here a number of years ago, we're looking for her records. And the woman turns to the white reporter and starts addressing her, starts answering the question. Well, you can't be in here, I don't know about that. And Deborah says, I guess I just became invisible. Okay. Or what about the professor who keeps referring to a male to female transgender student as he and him? Now you'll notice, and I think I was consistent, you'll notice throughout my PowerPoints, I use they and their. I use the plural instead of the singular he and or she, which gets awkward. Okay, why would I do that? Because these aggressions can be so subtle as a simple use of pronouns. Now, the point here is not to make you so painfully, consciously aware of something as simple as pronouns. Come in, have a seat. There's pizza back in the corner. Okay, it's not to make, but to just people to be aware of the subtlety that's involved in these kinds of things. Okay. Okay. Professor Jones was lecturing on the state of race relations in the United States and had just completed a section on the experiences of African American students in higher education. There's one African American student in the professor's class, and at one point he points at her and says, "Isn't that right?" What about that one?
Because you can't expect one person of color to represent all people of color.
All people of color. Does it happen all the time? Yes, it does. Okay. So what about lecturing to a psychology of women class and hear about male privilege, and there's one male student enrolled in the class. So he pointed at the male student and said, "Isn't that right?" Okay. Same thing. And typically here, actually, we get very few male students in the Psych of Women class, which is too bad. But because it's always nice to hear other points of view, but one male cannot speak for all men in the world. Okay. So, a little bit about what a microaggression is, and it's on the verge of becoming a buzzword, and once something becomes a buzzword, it tends to be trivialized, but the term racial microaggression has been around since the 1970s. There's a psychiatrist, Chester Pierce, who had coined the term, and there have been then numbers of studies that have been done examining microaggressions, these sort of everyday things that happen to people, like I've been illustrating. For example, Stanford University researchers have shown that African Americans and women perform worse on tests when they're primed with stereotypes about race and gender. So you sit them down in an experiment, you would sit them down and you would talk to them about the stereotypes, or they'd be sitting in a waiting room, supposedly waiting for their test, and they hear about the stereotypes, and they perform worse than students who weren't exposed to those stereotypes prior to taking the tests. There have been other studies where you had a group of students of color and a group of, and I think they primarily used African American students, group of white students, and they're told, and then they divide each of those groups in half, and they're told different things about the test they're about to take. Half of the white students and half of the black students are told that this test is really inconsequential, it's no big deal, just do what you can so you can get it over with. The other half of the white students and the other half of the black students are told that this is an IQ test and it's going to determine your suitability to go on in school. Okay, so in the first condition, how do you think they fared? This is no big deal. How do you think they fared? They actually scored pretty close to each other. There was no significant differences between the two groups. What do you think happened in the other group? Well, the white students scored, their scores went this way. The African American students, their scores went this way because of the stereotype about people, race, and IQ. Okay. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a lot of that, but that research about race and IQ goes back to over 100 years ago and has consistently perpetuated the myth that people of color are less intelligent than white people. And that myth permeates still today, even we should all be knowing better, but it still permeates society today and people still buy into it. We call this, by the way, stereotype threat, that based on stereotypes, you may do more poorly because you think that either the results are biased against you or they're going to be used against you. Then there have been other studies which have demonstrated repeatedly that white people, white of European origin, even those who consciously and outwardly and sincerely consciously and outwardly profess a belief and a commitment to equality, can actually act in racist manners. Again, there is this unconscious sort of implicit bias that we've all been socialized to on an unconscious level, and I don't mean a Freudian unconscious sense, but I'm talking about sort of outside our awareness, because this is how insidious it is, that they can act in racist manners. They may be shocked and appalled. Hopefully, they recognize it as immediately. But there are no matter who it is, can do these things, particularly in ambiguous situations. Studies that have measured job applicants, they've set up scenarios where you have a group of African American job applicants, pseudo job applicants, and a group of white job applicants, and when the person of color's qualifications clearly outweigh the white person's qualifications, then people tend to rate that person higher. But when it's ambiguous, when the qualifications are sort of equivalent, and they are, and there's some ambiguity, then white people tend to vote for white people unconsciously. So a couple of definitions of microaggression. It's the Oxford English Dictionary says it's a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. That definition has been broadened to include members of sexual minorities. Shelton and Delgado Romero, just about 4 years ago, microaggressions are communications of prejudice and discrimination expressed through seemingly meaningless and unharmful tactics. Okay, this is how that gets disguised. And the unfortunate thing is, depending on how it's expressed and the situation or the context, it actually allows the offender, it affords them the opportunity to deny it. Well, I didn't mean that. I apologize, and kind of gets them off the hook. Here are some examples, maybe of some microaggressions. Assuming the assumption that females are weaker in math. Now, it can be as subtle as there was a teacher can go into a classroom that has both male and female students, and if you were to measure time elapsed between when a child's hand goes, or a student's hand goes up and the teacher responds, if you've got a very sensitive stopwatch, and you were to measure, what you would find is that when posing a math question to a class, the teacher responds more quickly to the male students than the female students. Number of seconds add up to minutes, which add up to hours by the end of the academic year. Okay, that's how subtle this can be. Asking Asian students where they're born, or the other one is, so what are you? Okay, well, I'm a human being. Okay, but people will ask, or where were you born? Okay, or the assumption that I just flashed on this. When I was on my pre-doctoral internship, one of the other interns he was Italian and Mexican, and he could speak Spanish fluently, and he spoke a little Italian. Well, we were in a very large public hospital, and whenever they couldn't find an interpreter, they would call Art. Art got called to go translate German, French, Chinese, Farsi. Okay, he would get called because the assumption was, okay, that he could translate everything, or calling somebody. There was another one. A Korean student, when I was in graduate school, was called in to translate for a client that had wandered into the graduate school training clinic. The client was Chinese. Well, can you translate for her? No. First of all, I'm not Chinese, she said. Second of all, I don't even speak Korean, because she was raised here. Okay. Okay, now, I'm Scotch-Irish. I don't speak Gaelic. Okay. Asking a transgender person if they had surgery. Ooh. Besides the fact that that's just really personal. Okay. But the second thing is it's making an assumption that you're not real unless you've had everything altered. Assuming a student of color can speak for their entire race or ethnic group, and assuming a female student only dates males or vice versa. So, female student walks into her advisor's office and sits down and looking sort of sad, and the advisor is trying to counsel her and try to help cheer her up. And she said, "Well, what's your support group? You know, do you have friends or anything? Do you have a boyfriend? Okay, what's wrong with that? I know, I saw your reaction. What's wrong with that?
It's like, why would you assume? Like, how can you assume? Like, you just can't assume things like that.
Right, right. What should she have said? What should the counselor have said?
Something like, are you in a personal relationship? Do you have a personal relationship with someone?
Or are you dating somebody? Is there somebody special? Yeah, not, do you have a boyfriend? Okay, okay. That's a true story also. I'm just full of them. I found this graphic in an article that this water fountain right here represents a microaggression, because it is the only water fountain that this person can use. It's the colored water fountain. We took our girls to see Hidden Figures when it was the first weekend it was out. And partway through the film, I don't know if everybody's seen it, but partway through the film, you see the sign that says colored restroom. And so one of them blurted out in the middle of the theater, "What do they mean by colored?" So we had interesting conversations on the way home. I'm glad she asked it, because I think we kind of make assumptions, but love the innocence of children. Okay. Now, Sue also came up with some other terminology for different types of microaggressions. These are, he calls microassaults, conscious and intentional actions or slurs, calling names, displaying swastikas, deliberately serving a white person before a person of color in a restaurant, or moving the Asian American and African American colleagues to the back of the plane. And then there are micro insults. These are verbal but also nonverbal communications that can convey rudeness, insensitivity that serves to demean somebody's heritage and identity. An example would be a white colleague asking an African American or a colleague of color how she got her job. Okay, the implication there is you're an affirmative action hire, meaning they hired you only because and not because you're qualified. All right. And Micro-invalidations. Actually, another micro-insult I just thought of was, have you ever heard of the phrase, she or he is a credit to their race? Have you ever heard of that? Good. Unfortunately, you have now. I heard that phrase, actually, a student used it in a class of mine once a number of years ago, which was, sometimes those learning opportunities come up when you least expect them. What does the phrase say to you? What's implied in that phrase? What's implied in that phrase?
That there isn't very much worth to their race, so they're doing something that makes it okay.
Well, it allows you to acknowledge an accomplishment without changing your bias against the group by saying this is an outlier. This is not a typical member of the group. And so I could, if I were the holder of that belief, okay, and I were the one that made that statement, what it allows me to do is say, okay, yeah, she got an A in the class, or she got a better grade than me. She's a credit to her race. The rest of them, okay. But I've actually had students say that when I've used classroom examples, and so we stopped and dealt with it. Micro-invalidations. Communications that subtly exclude the thoughts, feelings, or experience of a person of color. So white people ask Asian Americans where they were born, or you know, what are you, conveying the idea that they're outsiders. Okay, to my knowledge, the vast majority of Asian Americans that I know were born in the United States. They are Americans. Okay, but that's so. Sue proposed these as, I wouldn't call them different levels of microaggressions. I would call them just different categories of microaggressions that range from the very, very subtle to the really, 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 really obvious. Now, there are a number of psychological and even physical effects of microaggressions that have been reported in the literature. There is a body of research, for example, that has studied why African American men, as a group, tend to suffer from hypertension more than white Eurocentric men. And it is, what they have found is that the variable that holds up from study to study to study is the constant stress of dealing with daily prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. And I would label all of that the microaggressions in the society. And that there are physical consequences. High blood pressure, depression, and anxiety. Then even what they call, although I think this is a contradiction in terms, mundane extreme environmental distress. Mundane means, kind of refers to sort of everyday. Extreme means a lot of it. Okay. They call racial battle fatigue, racial trauma, are some of the terms that researchers are using to refer to race-related health consequences. And again, physical conditions such as cardiovascular disease, and even elevated death rates and shortened lifespan are also have been attributed to stressors such as racial microaggressions. So a microaggression is not a single event. It's usually a collection. I mean it can be, but it's usually a collection of small, subtle, and it's constant, it's consistent, that somebody faces day to day, that they add up. They have a cumulative effect on the recipients. And they're not necessarily the result of conscious, overt bias or attempts to insult or harm, But again, many of these microaggressions are committed by otherwise kind people who consciously and again sincerely profess a belief in equality, but again, those implicit biases come out when, you know, under certain circumstances. Let me give you a couple of other examples of how many of you are familiar with the concept of driving while black? Well, it refers to the phenomenon of an increased likelihood of a car being pulled over by the police when an African American, usually male, is a driver. If you Google driving while black, you will find hundreds upon hundreds of stories of people just driving, stories of, I've had students who were driving on not this campus, but on a campus across the campus parking lot to go park at their student housing and got pulled over by campus police because he was a male, black, alone in a car, okay? Number of years ago when I was teaching at the University of Colorado, a student of mine, a white female, was telling, actually she came in very upset one day and was telling the class something that had happened to her over the weekend. She'd been out partying with two of her girlfriends, the three females were out partying. She's white, the other two were African American young women. They all lived in student housing together. This was in Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, Colorado is northwest of Denver. It's a trendy, upscale. Even back then, it was a little on the expensive side to live, and it's the location of the main campus, the University of Colorado. Well, they'd been out partying, and they tossed a coin, and they decided who was going to be the designated driver. Now, the car belonged to the white female, the white student. And they're driving back across Boulder, and the designated driver, one of the African-American women, was driving, and a police officer pulled them over. Now, the white female was sitting in the front seat, and then the other black female was sitting in the back seat. And the officer pulls them over, and before he said anything else, he looks in the window and he asked the white female if she was okay. Okay, now, she's hammered. Okay, they'd been out drinking, except for the driver. Any guesses what the officer did? He made the white female take over the driving and drive them back to student housing. True story. True story. And I actually confirmed it because you could get, as a faculty member, I could get a hold of the police report. Because it also went to the university. He didn't write a ticket. He didn't charge them with anything. He wanted to make sure they got home safe. But he made the white girl. And she tried to tell him she had been drinking. Okay. This brings us to the concept called minority stress. And what I have, let me back up, in the previous couple of slides, what I have been describing are the results of this constant barrage of these little things that with this cumulative effect that results in minority stress. And now I'm going to talk specifically about college campuses. This refers to the, oh, thank you. It refers to the unique stress experienced by minority students that actually interferes with college adjustment and integration into the university community, minority stress. So for many minority students, entering college may be their first exposure to being a minority in a predominantly white environment. And unless somebody's attending a historically black university or an historically Hispanic university, the likelihood of of being on a predominantly white campus is very high. Being the only ethnic minority student in a class can also isolate the student. I mean, think about all the places, all the possible places on this campus where being a member of an ethnic or sexual minority can isolate you. Okay, I would say anywhere on campus, couldn't it? Anywhere on campus. And that can be depending on the student's experience and what happens. They may ultimately, just simply the stress of being the minority can be enough that they ultimately decide to leave college. We do see very low retention rates among students of color who experience this type of situation. Minority students often experience stress because of their invisibility. There may or may not be overt racial tension, but simply being invisible is stressful. Racial segregations during in-class study groups. Okay. Nonverbal racist actions. There's a scene from there's an old movie about race relations on campus called Higher Learning. It might be on Netflix. And there is this scene, I call it a pivotal scene in the movie, where the white female student enters an elevator and there's an African American student standing there in the elevator. She looks at him and I think she shifts her purse to the other side, or her bag, she clutches it. Sitting in a stop sign in a car, and a car pulls up, and there's the car has a Latino or an African American driving, and we see the female lock the doors. Okay, those are some of the subtleties. Being assumed to have no academic concerns because of the model minority myth. Okay. Low faculty expectations because of the stereotype of lower intelligence. The belief that admissions were affirmative action cases. Now, what happens here is then that instead of being left to perform, left to sort of perform and do what they're always doing, they have to work. People have to work twice as hard to prove that they can succeed because it's such an uphill battle. It's kind of like trying to run in a swimming pool. If you've ever tried to run in a swimming pool, it's good for your legs, but it's exhausting. Or carrying 10-pound weight up a hill. If you think of that weight and actually the hill as this barrage of aggressions that are bombarding you, you can then imagine the person has to work twice as hard. That would also explain for depression, anxiety, and some physical ailments. Imagine, let me switch groups here. Imagine for the transgender person what it's like just simply going to the restroom. Okay, now the headlines and the newspapers and the internet has been full of this the last couple of years. But what is it like for a transgender person to go to a restroom? If that person chooses the restroom that matches their gender identity, they could easily be assaulted or kicked out. If that person goes to the restroom, uses the restroom that matches their anatomical, their birth anatomy, that's not an easy phrase to say, their birth anatomy, they also could get assaulted or kicked out. Okay. Simply going to the restroom on a college campus becomes a very big deal for the transgender student. I mean, on top of the pronoun issue and the name, the preferred name versus the legal name, and so forth. It's just getting up and going to the restroom becomes a really major undertaking. We do see among African American students as well as Latino students, minority stress has a strong association with reduced retention, resulting in low graduation rates. Latino students, many of them do not complete college because of the discrimination they experience at school. Asian American students have trouble finding mentors that help them sort of negotiate college or even stay in school. And transgender students experiencing what we call misgendering, which is what I've been talking about. Misgendering experience negative psychological and emotional effects related to their gender identity. So here's some examples of microaggressions on our campus or on any college campus. These are actually true stories. Student makes a homophobic or racist or sexist comment or joke in class. Professor doesn't know what to do about it, so opts to say nothing. What do you as students do in a situation like that? You're sitting in a class and a student makes a crack about a transgender student or makes a crack about an African American student or a female student. And the professor may look startled, may look uncomfortable, but goes on with the lecture. What do you as students do about that? What are your choices? What would you say?
I feel like that was inappropriate. I tell them why. Hopefully it starts a discussion.
Okay. Depending on the classroom, that may or may not be welcomed. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe if you have a specific opinion based on a certain thing, maybe go to that student specifically and just say, hey, you know what? We all have rights, but I just feel like that was very inappropriate for that specific, maybe not start a whole class discussion about maybe that topic, but just to approach that student and say, hey, you know what, there are different students here, like we need to consider their feelings and needs too, and so it would be better if we didn't talk about that kind of stuff during our class, perhaps.
Okay. Yes.
I would also address the professor and let them know that if this is going to be your classroom and we have the right to feel free in this classroom, I mean, and free and safe at the same time, I think the professor should hear that, because for next time that does happen, they don't freeze in that situation because they probably never have dealt with that before. But if you're going to facilitate a classroom where there's going to be multiple opinions, there should be some type of forum to speak on it and should be addressed in the classroom openly.
Exactly, and I think rules should be, come on, you can come on through. Rules should be set up, civility rules should be set up at the very beginning of the semester, but a lot of, depending on the course content, a lot of faculty don't think of that ahead of time. And so they get caught flat-footed when something like that happens. What happened in this situation actually was, this was in another class, a student came to me, I suggested that the student talked to the professor. I followed up and actually mentioned it to the professor myself, and so it never happened again. But yeah, the professor needs to be addressed because we're supposed to be in charge, and it's my job to make everybody's voice heard and make the classroom safe for all students. Students write. This happened last year. Students write anonymous sexist slurs on the women's study, I think, on the office door, and left them around the office. What do you do? What's your response? You walk by and you see something hanging like that.
Go to the dean of students.
Yeah, check the cameras.
Check the cameras. You can actually report it to campus police because they actually do keep count of bias crimes on this campus. Professor refuses to address a transgender student by the student's preferred name and pronouns, insisting on adhering to the roster and claims being unable to remember anyway. By this point, this professor very likely may have lost this transgender student because this student has been outed. We have I've been working on this for years, and now that we've got the all gender restroom signs changed to say all gender, and I'm working on having having banner adjusted so that preferred names can be put into banner and it can come out on the roster. The thing that schools fall back on is your legal name. What is your legal name? And your diploma has to be issued in your legal name, which is very, very unfortunate. Unless you spent the time and the expense to go to court and change your name. And what if your parents don't know? That's also the dilemma that many of our transgender students and gay and lesbian and bisexual students have, is that very often this is where they come out on the college campus and their parents don't know. So what do we do in terms of that kind of, correspondence? Department chair insists a lesbian faculty member should go meet the new professor in the other department because that new professor is gay. Now, this wasn't, the way the conversation actually went was, have you met so-and-so in this department? No. You should go meet her. Okay, I don't even deal with that department. Why would I? No, really, seriously. 2 days later, stop by. Really, you should go. This was like 12 years ago. You should go meet. Really, have you met? No, why? And it finally dawned. It finally made the connection. Oh, yeah, I get it. And racial slurs, and we've had incidents recently this winter of racial slurs being written. Which is very, 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 very unfortunate. People seem to think that anonymity gives them license to do this kind of thing. That, I mean, it's like on the internet. People think being on the internet because nobody can actually see you, that gives you license to say and do whatever you want to on the internet. The same thing happens here on college campuses. Again, like she said, report it to the dean of students, report it to campus police, so that they document it. Yes, sir.
Earlier you had asked a similar question. My first response mentally was to pull it off and then take it to somewhere and report it possibly. But why wouldn't you want to remove it instead of leaving it hang and then report it?
Well, that's a judgment call. If it's, I think there's nothing against removing it if it's not an official poster. So yeah, why not remove it and take it in and say, see, here's this. The other thing that happens is that the Resource Center, when we've had, and we've had a couple of, we've had conferences on this campus, Queer Health on Campus, that we have every other year, and when we have posters up and notices up advertising it, we just have to keep extra ones in our bag as we're walking around campus because people pull them down and tear them in half and write things on them, deface the posters. And actually, any of the Resource Center notices that we're vulnerable to that. And I think Tiny and a couple of our volunteers actually just automatically carry a whole bunch of them in their bag as they're walking across campus to replace them. Now, the other side of the coin is that there are those people in the field who think that we're blowing things way out of proportion by talking about microaggressions. Are they as rampant and are they as destructive as some people believe? One researcher, this was actually from the American Psychological Association, he stated that it restricts open and unencumbered conversation between racial groups, this emphasis on microaggression. It's making one group of people victims, and it's reinforcing their victimhood, making the other group of people the bad guys, and setting people up in an adversarial sort of relationship so that they can never come to agreement on issues relevant to, sort of racial issues between the two groups. What do you think about that? And it encourages anger. It encourages continually stirring up anger without any means of resolving it. Yes?
I think that these kind of conversations are helpful. Now, what makes it stressful and what makes it complicated is that people's feelings get in the way. And that's understandable because, yes, it's going to touch a nerve about race and how people feel. However, like, if that person can, whoever is feeling that aggression can be able to, subtract their feelings, kind of think logically about the situation, I think that's be an easier way to be able to kind of come to a solution. Because, of course, if you call me a name, I'm going to feel some type of way, and I want to talk about it. But thinking in a lower self, I'm not going to be able to express how I really feel logically to this person where they don't get offended. So in those type of conversations, yeah, it's going to create a victim mentality for that person. It's going to create anger. Of course, because like I said, feelings are involved, but it's about level of maturity when talking about things like this. You can't be immature and talk about something really important because you're not going to get anything situated, So I think a level of maturity has to come on both parties in order to be able to talk about a serious issue.
The level of maturity, yes. And here's the problem. Yes. Well, and I think, it's like what Reverend Barber was trying to do on the airline last year was he was trying to talk with this person, very reasonably mature. I think that he had the exact, I have to think he was probably somewhere down inside pretty ticked off, but he wanted to have a conversation, and that's when he got, unfortunately, escorted off the plane. But yeah, you're right. But what sometimes ends up happening is we have the victim group, the targeted group, angry, and then the sort of the perpetrators of the microaggressions get defensive, and then everybody digs in their heels, and nothing gets solved. So they may have a point, but like, as she said, yes, it takes a level of maturity. It takes a really good facilitator. And it takes a certain level of willingness to really take a look at one's own implicit bias. There is a test, I think you can still find it online, the implicit bias. What's it called? It measures implicit bias, and you're exposed to images of white faces and black faces, and then positive and negative words, and you have to respond very, very quickly. And what it does is it gives you the outcome. It gives you a rating of your preference for white versus your preference for black. And it's amazing. I remember one year I had my students take it because it was much easier to find on the internet than it is these days. But I had my students in this particular class I was teaching take it, and it was really interesting watching the level of defensiveness among students. Again, the students who, I'm liberal and I'm all for equality, and then find out that they had at least a moderate, if not high, preference for white. And oh no, it's wrong. On the other hand, the African American students who took it and also showed a preference for white. Okay, that's a function of socialization. What we have been taught from birth about what it means to be a person of color in this society. But that's what I'm talking about. It's those unconscious, implicit biases that, in moments of stress and different situations, they come springing to the surface. I stopped using that as an exercise in class, by the way, because it got too stressful for me to try to calm everybody down. So what can we as a campus community do to combat these microaggressive acts? The hard part, first of all, is teaching the victims how to defend against these microaggressions. You kind of have, people kind of have to pick and choose their battles. You have to think, do you really want to speak up every single time? What is your threshold? What is the victim's threshold for sort of fighting back or speaking up or defending? And knowing how and when to defend again, places a great deal of stress on the that the oppressors simply can't understand. Imagine being on the defensive all the time, waiting for somebody to say something or do something that's insulting or demeaning or so forth. So it depends on the type and context of the microaggression as well as it has on the targeted person. And again, that person's threshold, you know, how much can they just sort of, you know, okay, and how much that they, you know, that really, really injures them. Know your rights trainings can help people. We see more and more of these with the stop, you know, the publicity over stop and frisk laws, and all of the press that the police and racial minority groups are getting in the headlines these days with all of that. Know your rights so that people know, you know, at least on a legal standpoint, what rights they have and what they don't. Support groups, focus groups to talk about what's going on campus so that campus administration can then develop programs to help educate people about microaggressions, and also simply speaking up. Don't be a bystander. I mean, the takeaway today is don't be a bystander. Speak up, confront the offender, and pull down the signs. See that? I was saving it for last, but you put me. If you see it, say it, and if you experience it, confront it. Any other questions or comments? None? Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.